Welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today, we are going to look at the module titled Contribution of Indian Marxists. This title comes under the paper Classical Sociological Theory. When Marxism came into India in late 19th and early 20th century, what kind of discourses did it have to deal with, and what kinds of discourses did it generate? Marxism, which was more or less a Eurocentric idea and with its theoretical roots anchored in the experiences of the Western world and historic events, how could this particular theoretical frame be applied in an Indian context, especially which was still under the colonial rule at that point of time? This module will discuss how so-called Indian Marxists emerged during the colonial period and later, who questioned issues ranging from Indian nationalism to production, to division of labor, to caste and class continuum. Indian Marxists, historiographic background. It was a new approach in Indian historiography or historical writing in India on colonialism and nationalism. It is good to note from the onset that when one talks about Indian Marxism, it does not mean that all writers were Marxists, but that they were more or less adopted materialistic interpretations as a method of understanding and tools of analysis in the historical phenomena. Their interpretations were derived from historical philosophy of Karl Marx, the dialectical materialism. The essence of this new approach lies in the study of relationship between social and economic organization and its effects on historical events. Instead of political history, they gave more emphasis on the history of common people and the history of the less people, which today we call as the subaltern theory. From a preliminary perspective, Marxist historiography on modern India was inaugurated by one of the founders of Marxism in India, M.N. Roy, with his work India in Transition, published in 1922. It was followed by India Today of Parmadat in 1940 and the social background of Indian nationalism of A.R. Desai in 1959. All the three were classical Marxists and treated Indian national movement as the representation of particular stage in the development of mode of production. India Today was considered as an authoritative Marxist work for a long time. It became an important school of historiography in India. Dutt and Desai studied the negative and positive roles of Gandhi in the national movement. They highlighted the positive as he made the national movement a mass movement by awakening the backward masses with national consciousness. British conquest of India and the dawn of colonialism. Historians have established that Britain was able to subjugate and colonize India by about the middle of the 18th century. Britain, however, had trading contracts with India for a long period before that. Through her trade with India increased rapidly during the first half of the 18th century. According to Aditya Mukherjee, the trade during the first half of 18th century consisted primarily, that is about 3/4, of imports of textiles and silk from India, which was the largest grower of raw cotton and the largest producer and exporter of cotton textiles in the world till the end of the 18th century. He goes ahead to say that while Indian textiles were much less in demand in earlier centuries in European markets, as well as to exchange for spices from East Asia, one major impetus was the spurt in demand for Indian textiles was the facilitation of the golden age of the Atlantic slave trade. Indian textiles constituted the single largest item with which the slaves were paid for, accounting for about 27% of all goods shipped from England to Africa during the 18th century. Since Britain had nothing to sell to India, which she needed, therefore the imports from India were financed by export of treasure or bullion. At this stage, India was fully compensated for the growing export of its commodities, even though the compensation may have come relatively cheap to Britain. Thus, even though till the middle of the 18th century, India's contact with Britain had not yet acquired colonial characteristics, nevertheless, India fitted neatly into the structure of global domination by Europe that had commenced a few centuries ago, beginning with the cheap mining of gold and silver in the Americas and extending to the slave trade from Africa to the spice trade in East Asia. From about the middle of the 18th century, with the victory in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, once again Britain began to seize and subjugate India. The Indian problem. Palm Dutt, one of the Indian Marxists, beautifully formulates the Indian problem. The problem of India can be very simply stated. He says it is the problem of 370 million human beings who are living in conditions of extreme poverty and semi-starvation for the overwhelming majority, and are at the same time living under a foreign rule which holds complete control over their lives and maintains by force the social system leading to this condition. These hundreds of millions are struggling for life, for the means of life, for elementary freedom. The problem of the struggle is the problem of India. One human being in 6 is an Indian. This is a very simple arithmetical fact, and it is important to bear in mind at the outset in approaching Indian problems. Of the total world population estimated in 1931 at 2,025 million, India held 353 million, or 17%. The census report of 1931 states the population now even exceeds the latest estimates of the population of China, so that India now heads the list of all countries in the world in the number of their inhabitants. This most numerous people in the world, whether the census comparison with China is exact or not, is another question, for nobody knows the population of China, is subject to a foreign rule of a country 3,000 miles away, inhabited by 46 million people. This is an extraordinary fact of the modern world situation. There is nothing like it, and has been nothing like it in history. This is how Palm Dutt formulates the Indian problem. The stages of destruction of Hindustan by Britain and the role played by the East India Company. According to Dutt, British colonial administration gradually steps up and destroys Hindustan. In the earlier period of the initial steps of destruction, these were accomplished first by the East India Company's colossal direct plunder. He buttresses that the whole course of the 18th century, the treasures transported from India to England were gained much less by the comparatively insignificant commerce, but by direct exploitation of that country, by the colossal fortunes extorted and transmitted to England. On the second note, that says there was a neglect of irrigation and public works, which had been maintained under previous governments. In the third perspective, that posits that Britain introduced English landed system, private property in land with sale and alienation, and the whole English criminal code. And fourth, there was a direct prohibition of import of heavy custom duties imposed on imports. In the light of the East India Company, Palm enunciates that East India Company was not concerned to find outlets for British goods. It sought to secure a monopoly of trade in foreign goods exported into England and Europe from the East. The English manufacturing interests fought against the monopoly and secured the exclusion from England of Indian manufacturers, while rival British trading interests agitated for the abolition of the company's monopoly of Indian trade. So the company had monopolized trade, and India in question could neither import nor export. Outcome of British colonial rule. According to Dutt, when Karl Marx spoke of British rule causing a revolution in India and described England as the unconscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution, he had in mind, as his explanation made clear, a twofold process. The dual process is destructive and generative at the same time. From the destructive point of view, Palmer, deducing from the views of Karl Marx, talks about the old social order, and from the point of view of regeneration, that talks about the laying by the British in India a material basis and foundation for a new social order. The destruction of the old hand industry is still reflected in the continuing diminution of the total number of industrial workers, since that diminution is yet balanced by the slow advance of modern industry. According to Aditya Mukherjee, Karl Marx saw in the very process of destruction by colonialism of the pre-colonial Indian society the regenerative role of colonialism, as it opened up the possibility of growth of capitalism and industrialization in the colony. The hope was that colonialism would lead to the mirror image of capitalism being produced in the colony, and in that sense would play a historically progressive role. Indian Marxists in perspective. Abdul Rahman argues that Marxists conceptualize the nation of colonialism as aggregate of groups of people which are divided on class lines. They highlight the differences amongst those classes and emphasize that nationalism's claim of commonality are superficial. Hence, Marxist school of history writing engages with the aspiration of the marginalized sections of society. According to them, the struggle between the affluent and poor is the core of historical development. He goes on to say that the proletariat in India was byproduct or an unintentional contribution of colonial administration. Marxist historians talk about how colonial processes bring consciousness among certain classes of peasants and workers through shaking the historical links between them and their exploiters. According to Marx, for example, the material destruction caused by British loot in India would create conditions on which marginalized classes will build their own sources of emancipation. In other words, colonialism makes the poor classes aware enough to ask about their role and place in history of their societies. Though there is a criticism about the fact that Marxist historians overemphasize the class division in the Indian context, which somewhat marred the study of different other sections of society such as Dalits, Adivasis and women. Marxist discourse on caste and class. Marxist research has theorized on the central structures of state power and their relationship with dominant organized forces in Indian society. They focused on the state as the site of reference and have argued that it is through this lens nebulous power relations and the politics of power in democracy can be gauged. Marxists argue that the Indian state symbolizes bourgeois interests and therefore it is a bourgeois state. Marxists such as Kaviraj, Balgopal and Sanyal, for instance, visualize the state as the primary site wherein power and authority are centralized, and its control has enabled the ruling class coalition to dominate and hegemonize the subaltern classes. Burden identified the capitalists, the rich, farmers and the bureaucracy as the three dominant classes competing and aligning with one another within a political space supervised by relatively autonomous state. The dominant class coalition model was employed by Kaviraj, in which, by using Gramsci's ideas of the passive revolution as a blocked dialectic, he was able to ascribe to the process of class domination in post-colonial India its own dynamic. Power had to be shared between the dominant classes because no one class had the ability to exercise hegemony on its own. But sharing was a process of ceaseless push and pull, with one class gaining a relative ascendancy at one point only to lose it at another. Kaviraj provides a synoptic political history of the relative dominance and decline of the industrial capitalists, the rural elites and the bureaucratic managerial elite within the framework of the passive revolution of capital. In a recent intervention, Chatterjee further qualifies the conventional Marxist understanding. He argues that the political power can be examined in terms of contestations between two spheres: a congruous civil society, that is urban middle classes, that follows the normative cultural models of the bourgeoisie, and a more ill-defined political society consisting of the rural and urban poor. He contends that the capitalist class in India exercises its considerable influence over both the central and the state governments, not through electoral mobilization of political parties and movements, but largely through the bureaucratic managerial class, the increasingly influential print and visual media, and the judiciary and other autonomous regulatory bodies. According to Kaviraj, the state in India is a bourgeois state, A, because of the dominance enjoyed by the capitalist class or a coalition of the classes dominated by the bourgeoisie, and B, because the state form is bourgeoisie, that is parliamentary democratic form, as being historically a bourgeoisie form of government in which political grievances do not reach a level that disrupts the minimal stability required for capitalist production. And C, the state expresses and ensures the domination of the bourgeois and helps in capitalist reproduction and a subordinate reproduction of other type of economic relations by imposing on the economy a deliberate order of capitalist planning. Those directives function that capital cannot perform through the market, either because the market is imperfect or not powerful enough, or because such tasks cannot be performed by market pressure. The bourgeois state performs through the legitimized directive mechanism of the state. Colonial policies, together with certain historical incidents, structured this form of democracy in India. These were A, integration of the Indian economy into the capitalist international market and its division of labor, and B, the received structure of colonial economic retardation. C, the preference of the leadership of the new Indian state in favor of capitalist strategy of economic growth through a set of basic legal and institutional forms, such as the format of legal rights in the constitution, the set of ordinary laws ruling economic and corporate behavior, the enactment of industrial policy, and other similar initiatives. Thus, an assessment of the ruling class dynamics, the contradictions and contestations on the one hand, in which these coalitional partners try to outflank one another, and on the other hand, consensus building through coalitions so as not to threaten and rupture their rule, enables us to comprehend the changes occurring at the level of democratic politics. This political process can thus be described in terms of changing patterns of checks and balances in the ruling class coalition. Bal Gopal argues in a similar vein that leadership, which emanates from the ruling classes, and the state are symbiotically linked, wherein the state creates channels of patronage, networks that link the interests and thus the loyalty of the masses to the ruling classes. He further argues that it is through the state that the leadership enriches them, and it is through the state they can claim to the loyalty of the masses. Thus, it is through state that the political elite extends its patronage and maintain its legitimacy. According to Kaviraj, the ruling class in India is a coalition of interest groups possessing material and social cultural resources. These are the bourgeoisie, the landed elite, and the bureaucratic managerial elite. They can rule only when they exist as a coalition, because capital is not an independent and dominant entity in Indian society and state. Similarly, due to certain historical and sociological reasons, single-handed and unaided dominance in society is also ruled out for the other propertied classes. He therefore argues that this coalition is not an effect or an accidental attribute of a dominance which is otherwise adequate. It is its condition. However, he opines that it is the capitalist bourgeoisie who are the dominant groups within this coalition, because it is this section that has a coherent and internally flexible development paradigm. He further argues that the pre-capitalist elements are still rooted in the feudal mode and do not have an alternative coherent ideology through which to operate. Their efforts have been restricted mainly to adjusting to the capitalist transition by ensuring survival plans for their own class. They have contented themselves by operating not as an alternative leading group, but as a kind of relatively more reactionary pressure group within the ruling combined, trying to shift or readjust the balance of policies in retrograde direction. One of the major problems faced by traditional Marxist scholars was emphasizing this overarching ruling class argument in understanding local and regional, societal level phenomena such as caste-based politics. This rather rigid frame of argument that a privileged class-based analysis foreclosed the option of assessing the role of other cultural and social categories and practices operating in politics. It's a universal premise based on the class analysis internalized the logic of homogeneity that also proved to be a hindrance in examining the micro-level politics. Chatterjee also deviates from the classical Marxist school. He presents his arguments in the period of post-liberalization, that is post-1991. He argues that although the state continues to be the most important mediating apparatus in negotiating between conflicting class interests, the autonomy of the state in relationship to the dominant classes appears to have been redefined. Crucially, the earlier role of the bureaucratic managerial class, or more generally of the urban middle classes, is leading and operating both socially and ideologically. The autonomous interventionist activities of the developmental state has significantly weakened. He points out that the critical difference has been produced by a split in the field of the political between a domain of properly constituted civil society and a more ill-defined and contingently activated domain of political society. Civil society in India today, people largely by the urban middle classes, is the sphere that seeks to be congruent with the normative models of bourgeois civil society and represents the domain of capitalist hegemony. If this were the only relevant political domain, then India would have probably be indistinguishable from other Western capitalist democracies. But there is the other domain, what Chatterjee calls political society, which includes large sections of the rural population and the urban poor. These people do, of course, have the formal status of citizens and can exercise the franchise as an instrument of political bargaining, but they do not relate to the organs of the state in the same way as the middle classes do, nor do governmental agencies treat them as proper citizens belonging to the civil society. Those in political society make their claims on government and in turn are governed not within the framework of stable, constitutionally defined rights and laws, but rather through temporary, contextual and unstable arrangements arrived at through direct political negotiations. The latter domain, which represents the vast bulk of democratic politics in India, is not under the moral political leadership of the capitalist class. Hence, his argument is that the framework of passive revolution is still valid for India, but its structure and dynamics have undergone a change. The capitalist class has come to acquire a position of moral political hegemony over civil society, consisting principally of the urban middle classes. Scholars such as Rudra and Patil and Omvit argue that the traditional Marxist theoreticians did not pay attention to caste and similar issues in India. Marxist historians too did not give much importance to this. Omvit argues that the Marxist organization and their ideologies find it easy to explain caste behavior simply as a manifestation of class behavior. The methodology employed by such Marxists does not pay much attention to the history of class formation in India or to the nature of pre-capitalist formation in India and the relevance of caste to it. She believes that at the time of independence, Indian agriculture was predominantly feudal in character, though important elements of capitalism had risen. This was a caste-structured form of feudalism which existed before the colonial period. When the colonial state no longer officially reinforced caste system, caste and class began to represent separate social phenomena. But there was still a near absolute correlation between them. Because of the particular caste aspect of Indian feudalism, Omvit affirms the anti-feudal movement was expressed not only through peasant revolts but also in the radical anti-caste movements. However, within the Marxist scholarship, there was disagreements regarding the mode of production in agriculture, and this debate was captured in the Economic Political Weekly from 1970 to 81, which was summarized by Alice Thorner. She argues that the existence of widespread tenancy and or sharecropping does not necessarily indicate the presence of feudal relations of production, nor does the concentration of land holding together with cultivation of small units by a large number of peasants. She contends that the shift from exploitation through tenants to large scale or intensive farming by means of hired labor does indicate capitalist relations and the growth of capitalist farming. Servile, debt bonded and or traditionally tied labor has been largely supplanted by free, relatively mobile wage labor, paid, if meagerly, for the most part in cash. Investment in modern scientific agriculture has enormously expanded and has resulted on the whole in enhanced production, at least of certain crops in certain areas. Tenancy and sharecropping arrangements have yet in many regions been adopted to the new economic and technical requirements. Yet master-servant type of behavior, extra economic constraints, rack renting and usury have by no means disappeared. A particular feature of the Indian scene is that the vast mass unemployment or underemployment who, if they cannot emigrate, find jobs outside of agriculture, exercise upward pressure on the rental price of land and downward pressure on wages. Thus, to finally conclude, this particular module tried to examine how the Indian Marxists face challenges trying to apply a heuristic device and theoretical model which was based in Europe, but which was now being used across the world, right from Latin America to Africa and to other Asian countries. This Marxist theoretical frame enabled Indian Marxists to understand the growing problems and specializations in the division of labor in India and the kind of capitalism that was emerging in India through the colonial rule. This also enabled Indian Marxists to see a new kind of relationship developing between caste and a new order of class that emerged.